Blood pooled on the sterile white tiles of a forgotten Chicago clinic, changing a desperate nurse's destiny forever. One bullet wound, one stitched artery, one terrifying patient who refused to give his name. By sunrise, her debts vanished, but a deadly, inescapable web had already tightened around her throat. Rain lashed mercilessly against the reinforced glass doors of St. Jude's Urgent Care. Located deep in the heart of Chicago's South Side, the clinic was a dilapidated sanctuary for those who couldn't afford proper hospitals and those who actively avoided them. Clara Hayes, a 26-year-old trauma nurse, was working her 5th consecutive graveyard shift. She was exhausted, her scrubs smelling faintly of antiseptic and cheap, stale coffee. She sat at the front desk, staring at a final notice bill from Navient. $84,000 in nursing school debt loomed over her head like a guillotine. The clock on the wall read 2:14 a.m. The clinic was empty. Dr. Heirs, the attending physician, was passed out in the break-room lounge chair, nursing a mild hangover. Clara was just about to rest her forehead against the cool Formica counter when the front doors violently shattered open. The wind howled into the lobby, bringing with it 2 figures. The first man was a hulking monolith of muscle, dressed in a soaked leather jacket. His face was scarred, his eyes wide and frantic. He was half carrying, half dragging the second man. The second man was the one who commanded the room, even while bleeding to death. He wore a bespoke charcoal wool suit. Clara's trained eye instantly recognized the flawless Italian tailoring, completely ruined by the massive crimson stain spreading across his left abdomen. He was tall, with sharp, aristocratic features, a hard jawline, and piercing, predatory grey eyes that didn't hold an ounce of fear. He didn't look like the usual gangbangers that stumbled into St. Jude's. He looked like old money, power, and absolute violence. "Help him!" the hulking man growled, his thick Russian accent slicing through the quiet room. "Now!" Clara bolted upright, her medical instincts overriding her rising panic. "I need to call 911. We aren't equipped for major trauma." Before her hand could even graze the telephone receiver, the larger man crossed the room in 2 strides. He slammed a heavy, steel Glock 19 onto the front desk, the barrel pointing directly at Clara's chest. "No cops!" the man hissed. "No hospitals! You fix him here, or you die here!" Clara swallowed hard, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She looked past the gun to the bleeding man leaning against the doorway. Even clutching his side, his posture was rigidly straight. He met her gaze. "Put the gun away, Grigori," the bleeding man said. His voice was a low, raspy baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Clara's spine. "You're scaring the nurse, and we need her hands steady." He staggered forward, leaving a trail of dark, thick blood on the linoleum. Clara rushed around the counter, grabbing a rolling gurney. "Get him on here," she ordered Grigori, her voice shaking only slightly. "Wheel him to Trauma Bay 2. It has the best lighting." Once they got him onto the bed, under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, Clara went to work. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and unceremoniously cut through the man's expensive shirt. The metallic smell of copper and rain filled the small room. "What's your name?" Clara asked, trying to keep him conscious as she applied pressure to the wound with thick gauze pads. The man gritted his teeth as she pressed down. "Alexander," he rasped. "All right, Alexander, I'm Clara," she said, her hands moving swiftly. She assessed the damage. The bullet had entered his left oblique, narrowly missing the kidney, and exited through the flank. It was a clean, through and through, but it had clipped an artery. "You're losing a lot of blood. I have to clamp the bleeder and stitch you up. I don't have general anesthesia here. Only local lidocaine. It's going to hurt." "Do it!" Alexander commanded, his grey eyes locking onto hers. Clara prepped the syringe, injecting the numbing agent around the jagged edges of the wound. Grigori stood like a stone gargoyle in the corner, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. As Clara worked, using hemostats to find and clamp the bleeding vessel, she noticed Alexander wasn't screaming. He wasn't even groaning. He was simply watching her. His gaze was intense, analytical, and entirely too calm for a man who had nearly been assassinated. He studied the curve of her jaw, the intense focus in her hazel eyes, the stray strand of auburn hair that had escaped her messy bun. "You have good hands, Clara," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her wrist as she leaned in close to suture the inner tissue. "Please don't talk," she muttered, tying off a delicate knot. "You need to conserve your energy." "Why are you working in a dump like this?" he asked, ignoring her instruction. "You're too skilled for this place." "Because the dumps are the only places hiring nurses straight out of school who need double shifts," she replied curtly, grabbing the staple gun for his external skin. "Brace yourself." Click, click, click. Alexander flinched, his jaw tight, but his eyes never left hers. There was a strange, dangerous electricity crackling between them in that cramped, blood-stained room. Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks, completely inappropriate for the terrifying situation. 45 minutes later, the bleeding was stopped. He was bandaged tightly with heavy compression dressings. Clara wiped the sweat from her brow and disposed of her bloody gloves. "You need a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics, ciprofloxacin," Clara said, turning to the medical cabinet. "And you need to stay off your feet. If those staples rip, you will bleed out before you reach an actual hospital." Alexander slowly sat up on the edge of the gurney, wincing. Grigori immediately stepped forward to help him into a fresh, albeit cheap, scrub top Clara had provided. "You have my gratitude, Clara," Alexander said softly. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out his phone, sending a quick text. "Just, please leave before my attending wakes up," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And take your blood-soaked clothes with you." Grigori tossed a heavy canvas bag onto the metal counter. It landed with a dense thud. "For your trouble," the Russian enforcer grunted. Alexander stood, leaning heavily on Grigori. He paused at the door of the trauma bay, looking back at her one last time. "Be careful going home tonight, Clara." With that, they vanished back into the stormy Chicago night. Clara stood in the quiet clinic for a long moment, listening to the rain. With trembling hands, she unzipped the canvas bag. Inside were thick, tight bundles of $100 bills wrapped in Blue Chase bank bands. Easily $50,000. Sitting right on top was a heavy, blood-smeared platinum Rolex Daytona watch. Clara clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob of pure terror. She knew enough about the streets of Chicago to know one absolute truth. Taking mafia money meant they owned you. The morning sun clawed its way through the smog of the city, casting a dreary grey light through the cracked blinds of Clara's Pilsen apartment. She hadn't slept. She had scrubbed the clinic floor with industrial bleach, hidden the canvas bag in the false bottom of her locker, and ridden the CTA bus home in a state of paralyzing paranoia, jumping at every shadow. She sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress, a cold cup of tea trembling in her hands. The digital clock read 8:30 a.m. Her cell phone buzzed violently on the nightstand, making her jump. The caller ID flashed Arthur Pendleton, her notoriously aggressive landlord who had been threatening eviction for 3 weeks. Clara took a deep breath and answered. "Mr. Pendleton, I told you I get paid on Friday." "Miss Hayes!" Pendleton's voice was shockingly cheerful, devoid of its usual gravelly hostility. No need to worry about Friday. I'm just calling to confirm receipt of the cashier's check. A very polite gentleman dropped it off at my office an hour ago. You're paid up for the next 2 years, including utilities. Let me know if you need any maintenance done, okay? Have a blessed day." The line clicked dead. Clara stared at the phone. Paid for 2 years. Before her brain could process the impossibility of the situation, her email notification pinged. It was an automated message from Navient. Subject: account update. Balance paid in full. Clara opened the email, her eyes scanning the bold letters. Her $84,320 balance was zero. Paid via an anonymous corporate wire transfer originating from a holding company called AR Logistics. A.R. Alexander. The air in the tiny apartment suddenly felt too thin to breathe. This wasn't gratitude. This was a hostile takeover of her life. He had found out everything about her in a matter of hours. Her address, her landlord, her student loans. If he could erase her debts with a snap of his fingers, he could just as easily erase her. She had to run. She had to pack a bag, grab her younger sister Sarah from her dorm at Northwestern University, and disappear. Clara threw open her closet, frantically pulling down a dusty duffel bag. She tossed in jeans, sweaters, her passport, and whatever cash she had in her wallet. She zipped the bag, threw on her coat, and practically kicked her apartment door open. She froze. Standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway of her apartment building was Grigori. In the daylight, his scarred face looked even more intimidating. He was wearing a sharp black suit today, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. "Good morning, Miss Clara," Grigori said, his tone polite but firm. "Mister, Romano requests your presence for breakfast. I have somewhere to be," Clara stammered, gripping the strap of her duffel bag so hard her knuckles turned white. "Tell him thank you for the money, but I can't." Grigori didn't move. He simply looked down at the duffel bag, then back up to her face. "It was not a request, Miss Clara. The men who shot Mr. Romano last night, they are the Kozlov Syndicate. They have police on their payroll. They know a nurse at St. Jude's patched him up. If you walk out of this building alone, you will be dead before you reach the subway station." Clara's blood ran cold. "What? My car is downstairs," Grigori said, gesturing to the stairwell. "Please." Clara had no choice. She followed the giant down the stairs and out onto the street. Idling by the curb, looking entirely out of place in her run-down neighborhood, was a sleek, black, bulletproof Mercedes Maybach. Grigori opened the rear door. Clara climbed in, sinking into the plush leather. The partition between the driver and passenger was up. She was completely isolated. They drove through the city, heading north toward the affluent Gold Coast. 30 minutes later, the car pulled into the underground parking garage of the St. Regis Chicago, one of the most exclusive and secure residential skyscrapers in the city. Grigori escorted her up a private elevator that required retinal scanning. The doors opened directly into a sprawling, 2-story penthouse, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, panoramic view of Lake Michigan. Sitting at a long mahogany dining table, wearing a dark silk robe over his bandages, was Alexander Romano. He was sipping a small cup of black espresso, a tablet resting in front of him. In the daylight, he was devastatingly handsome, a lethal combination of old-world Italian elegance and modern corporate ruthlessness. "Clara," Alexander said smoothly, looking up. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit. Have you eaten?" "You paid off my loans," Clara blurted out, refusing to sit. "You paid my rent. You tracked me down. You saved my life," Alexander replied calmly, setting his espresso down. "In my world, all debts are paid in full. I do not like owing anyone." "I didn't ask for a reward," Clara cried, her frustration boiling over her fear. "I just want to be left alone." Alexander's expression hardened, the brief warmth in his eyes vanishing, replaced by a chilling ice. He stood up slowly, wincing slightly at his wound, and walked around the table until he was standing mere inches from her. He towered over her, his presence suffocatingly powerful. "Listen to me very carefully, Clara," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made her tremble. "Last night, my own uncle sold me out to the Kozlov Bratva. They ambushed me at the docks. I survived because of you. But in doing so, you stepped into my world." He reached out, his large, warm hand gently gripping her chin, tilting her face up to meet his intense gaze. "Valery Kozlov knows about you. He has a detective named Harris, a dirty cop in the 12th district, pulling security footage from the streets around your clinic right now. By tonight, they will have your name. And they will come to your apartment to torture you to find out where I am." Clara's breath hitched. Tears welled in her eyes. "My sister, Sarah, is already safe," Alexander interrupted. "My men intercepted her an hour ago. She is currently on a private jet, heading to my villa in Tuscany. She thinks she won a mysterious luxury study abroad scholarship." Clara stared at him, absolute shock washing over her. He had orchestrated her entire life in the span of 6 hours. "Your old life is over, Clara," Alexander whispered, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek, a surprisingly tender gesture from a man so dangerous. "You are officially dead to the world. From this moment forward, you belong to me. You are my private physician, and you will live in my estate. It is the only way I can keep you alive." The city sprawled beneath them, ignorant to the fact that Clara Hayes had just been erased from existence, swallowed whole by the king of the Chicago underworld. And as Alexander looked down at her, Clara realized the most terrifying part wasn't that she was a prisoner. It was the dark, magnetic thrill pooling in her stomach, warning her that she might never want to leave. The following 3 weeks blurred into a surreal, high-stakes waiting game. Clara's world shrank from the sprawling, chaotic streets of Chicago to the sterile, opulent confines of the St. Regis penthouse. She was a ghost, legally deceased in the eyes of the state. A fabricated news report, courtesy of Alexander's vast network, detailed a tragic, fiery car crash on Interstate 90. Clara Hayes was gone. In her place was a woman adorned in imported silk, pacing the hardwood floors of a sky-high fortress. Her daily routine revolved entirely around the recovery of the most dangerous man in the city. Alexander was an infuriating patient. The moment his fever broke, he was conducting hostile takeovers from his dining room table, flanked by Grigori and a rotating cast of imposing suited lieutenants. Yet, whenever Clara entered the room with fresh bandages and saline solution, the room fell dead silent. The men would avert their eyes, a silent testament to the absolute authority Alexander wielded, and by extension, the untouchable status he had granted her. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Clara scolded one Tuesday evening, peeling the adhesive dressing from his oblique. The jagged red line of the sutured wound looked angry, but there was no sign of infection. Alexander set down a thick dossier detailing the illicit shipping routes of the Kozlov syndicate. He leaned back, allowing her access. "My uncle Lorenzo is bleeding my territory dry while he thinks I am incapacitated. He is rallying the old guard, promising them peace with Valery Kozlov in exchange for my head. I do not have the luxury of rest. If you tear these internal stitches, Lorenzo won't have to do anything," Clara retorted, her fingers gently probing the tender tissue. Alexander hissed through his teeth, not from the pain, but from the proximity. His hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist. His grip was firm but careful. "You have a sharp tongue for a woman who was trembling like a leaf 3 weeks ago." "I'm adapting," Clara said, refusing to break eye contact. The proximity between them was a constant, suffocating electricity. She could smell his cologne, bergamot and cedar, mixed with the sharp scent of the antiseptic. "You are," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising back to her hazel eyes. "You are adapting beautifully. But the storm has not yet broken, Clara. Detective Harris has been rattling cages at St. Jude's. He interrogated Dr. Heirs yesterday." Clara's blood ran cold. "Did Heirs say anything?" "He knows nothing to say," Alexander replied, releasing her wrist. "But Harris is desperate. Valery Kozlov is running out of patience, and when a dog is backed into a corner, it bites recklessly." The bite came 48 hours later. It was shortly after midnight. The city below was submerged in a torrential downpour, lightning fracturing the dark sky over Lake Michigan. Clara was in the vast marble kitchen, pouring a glass of water, when the ambient lighting of the penthouse suddenly flickered and died. The hum of the central air conditioning ceased. Total, suffocating silence descended. A split second later, the heavy oak double doors of the penthouse elevator lobby violently blew inward. The concussive blast shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows, sending a tidal wave of glass raining onto the Persian rugs. Wind and rain instantly howled into the living room. Clara dropped her glass. It shattered on the marble. "Clara, get down!" Alexander's roar cut through the chaos. Gunfire erupted, the deafening staccato of suppressed automatic weapons tearing through the drywall and shredding the expensive furniture. Clara dove behind the massive granite kitchen island, pressing her hands over her ears as marble chips rained down on her hair. Through the darkness, she saw the tactical laser sights, 3 neon green beams cutting through the smoke and dust. Lorenzo's hit squad had bypassed the building's security. A mole. Someone had let them up. Alexander moved with terrifying, lethal grace. Despite his healing wound, he slid across the floor, retrieving a heavy assault rifle hidden beneath a false panel in the floorboards. Grigori was already returning fire from the hallway, his massive frame shielding the primary corridor. "Push forward, he's injured!" A heavily accented voice shouted over the gunfire. It wasn't Russian, it was Italian, Lorenzo's personal guard. Alexander returned fire, a deafening burst that dropped the first man stepping through the ruined elevator doors. Blood sprayed against the pristine white walls. "Grigori, flank right!" Alexander commanded, clutching his left side as he retreated toward the kitchen island, sliding in next to Clara. He was breathing heavily, his white shirt already blooming with a fresh, terrifying crimson stain. The stitches had torn. "You're bleeding!" Clara panicked, her medical instincts warring with pure terror. "Forget the blood," Alexander snarled, shoving a sleek, heavy Sig Sauer pistol into her trembling hands. "There are 4 left. Grigori can only hold the choke point for so long. If one gets past the island, you point, you pull the trigger, and you do not hesitate. Do you understand me?" Clara stared at the cold steel in her hands. She had sworn an oath to preserve life. I can't." Alexander grabbed her face, his thumb smearing a streak of soot and his own blood across her cheek. His grey eyes were wild, feral, and utterly desperate. "If they take me, they will torture you to death for your involvement. You are Clara Romano tonight. Survive. Survive for me." He didn't wait for her answer. He broke cover, laying down suppressing fire to draw their attention. Clara pressed her back against the granite, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard heavy boots crunching on broken glass, moving closer to the kitchen. The shooter was flanking Alexander while he was distracted. Clara Romano. The name echoed in her mind. He had claimed her, protected her, and now he was dying for her. A shadow fell over the edge of the kitchen island. A man in tactical gear stepped into view, raising his weapon toward Alexander's exposed back. Clara didn't think. The adrenaline overrode her conscience. She raised the Sig Sauer, squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, and pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her palm, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. She opened her eyes. The man stumbled backward, a neat hole punched through his tactical vest, right where his collarbone met his throat. He collapsed to the floor, choking on his own blood. The penthouse went dead silent. Alexander slowly turned, looking at the dead man, and then at Clara. She was shaking violently, the gun still raised, tears streaming down her face. He dropped his rifle, ignoring his bleeding side, and crossed the room, wrapping his arms around her and burying her face in his chest. "It's over," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "You did perfectly. It's over." The aftermath of the attack was swift and ruthlessly efficient. Within 20 minutes, Alexander's loyalists had flooded the building. The bodies were removed, the security feeds wiped, and the compromised St. Regis concierge, Officer David Jenkins, was quietly taken down to the loading docks for a conversation he would not survive. Clara sat in the master bedroom, her hands covered in Alexander's blood. She had restitched his side, her hands moving mechanically, completely numb to the gore. She had crossed a line tonight. There was no going back to the naive nurse at St. Jude's. She had taken a life to save a monster, and the terrifying truth was that she did not regret it. The bedroom door opened. Grigory stepped in, his suit torn, wiping blood from his knuckles with a silk handkerchief. "Mr. Romano," Grigory rumbled, "we have him. He was trying to board a private flight at Midway." Alexander, sitting bare-chested on the edge of the bed, slowly buttoned a fresh black shirt over his new bandages. His eyes were devoid of mercy. "Bring him to the study." Clara watched him stand. "Alexander." He paused, looking back at her. The softness he usually reserved for her was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating apex predator of the Chicago's underworld. "Stay here, Clara. What happens next is not for you to see." "No," Clara said, surprising herself. She stood up, wiping her bloody hands on a towel. "I killed a man tonight for you. I'm already in this. I'm not hiding in the bedroom." A slow, dark smile curved Alexander's lips. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pride. He extended his hand to her. She took it, his grip warm and anchoring. They walked into the ruined study. The wind was still howling through the shattered windows. Kneeling in the center of the room, bruised and bleeding, was Lorenzo Romano. The gray-haired patriarch looked pathetic, shivering in his expensive suit, surrounded by Alexander's heavily armed guards. "Alexander, please," Lorenzo begged, his voice trembling. "It was Kozlov. Valeri poisoned my mind. He promised to spare the family if I gave him you." Alexander didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stood over his uncle, the embodiment of death. "You broke the blood oath, Lorenzo. You sent dogs into my home. You endangered what is mine." Alexander's hand tightened slightly around Clara's. "She is just a nurse," Lorenzo spat, looking at Clara with absolute disgust. "You burn our empire for a civilian whore." Before Alexander could move, Clara stepped forward. The trembling girl from the clinic was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in the fires of survival. "I saved his life," Clara said, her voice eerily calm, echoing in the ruined room. "And I will ensure he outlives you all." Alexander looked at her, his eyes blazing with a dark, consuming passion. He reached into his coat, drew a suppressed pistol, and without looking back at his uncle, pulled the trigger. The dull thwack of the bullet ended Lorenzo Romano's treachery forever. "Call Valery Kozlov," Alexander instructed Grigori, stepping over the body. "Tell him I am sending him my uncle's head in a cooler. Tell him Detective Harris is next, and tell him the war has officially begun." A month later, the Chicago skies were traded for the sun-drenched vineyards of Tuscany. Clara stood on the balcony of a sprawling, heavily fortified Italian villa, holding a glass of Chianti. Below, in the courtyard, her sister Sarah was laughing, entirely oblivious to the bloodshed that had funded her luxurious new life. Strong arms wrapped around Clara's waist from behind. Alexander pressed a kiss to her bare shoulder. He smelled of bergamot, leather, and absolute power. The Kozlov syndicate in Chicago had been systematically dismantled, their leadership wiped out in a string of brutal, calculated strikes orchestrated by the man holding her. "Do you miss it?" Alexander murmured against her neck. "The clinic, the quiet life." Clara leaned back into his chest, looking down at the massive, flawless diamond resting on her left ring finger. It was heavy. It was a brand. It was a crown. She turned her head, capturing his lips in a fierce, possessive kiss. "There is no quiet life anymore, Alexander," she whispered, her hazel eyes locking onto his stormy grey ones. "There is only our life, and I am exactly where I belong." She had treated a Mafia boss's injury to save her own life. In the end, she had conquered his entire world. If you loved this intense, dark romance, filled with Mafia betrayal and a fierce heroine, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share. Clara and Alexander's story with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, high-stakes, romantic storytelling every single week. Drop a comment below. Would you have saved the Mafia boss? See you in the next video.